Right. Kia ora everybody out there. Everyone that's situated all around the globe, welcome to our day 3 webinar. Very, very lucky today. I've got my 2 favourite economists online with me. So I'm really looking forward to getting into some interesting kōrero. I thought instead of starting with a karakia, I'm going to start with a poem. So I'll bring that up for everybody to see, and you can read it with me if you like. Now, this poem is by Ngāti Hine Ngāpuhi writer Nadine Ann Hura. I don't actually personally know her, but I really admire some of the work and the writing that she puts out. So read with me this beautiful poem that Nadine has written. Rest now, e papatuanuku. Breathe easy and settle. Right here where you are will not move upon you for a while. We'll stop, we'll cease. We'll slow down and stay home. Draw each other close and be kind, kinder than we've ever been. I wish we could say we were doing it for you as much as ourselves, but hey, we're doing it anyway. It's right. It's time. Time to return. Time to remember. Time to listen and forgive. Time to withhold judgment. Time to cry. Time to think about others. Remove our shoes. Press hands to soil. Sift grains between fingers. Gentle palms. Time to plant. Time to wait. Time to notice to whom we belong. For now, it's just you and the wind and the forest and the oceans and the sky full of rain. Finally, it's raining. Ka turuturu te waikamu o rangikirunga i a koe. Embrace it. The sacrifice of solitude we have carved out for you. He iti noiho, a small offering. People always said that it wasn't possible to ground flights and stay home and stop our habits of consumption. But it was. It always was. We were just afraid of how much it was going to hurt. And it is hurting, and it will hurt and continue to hurt, but not as much as you have been hurt. So be still now. Wrap your heels around our absence. Loosen the concrete belt, cinch tight at your waist. Rest, breathe, recover, heal. And we will do the same. Kia ora. All right.
Beauty. Sounds like some people are having trouble hearing online, but others say that they can hear just fine.
Okay, it'll be on their end then. Okay. All right, so he mihi tēnei ki a kōrua. Nau mai hara mai ki tēnei hui, tēnei digital hui. Mauri o mai o kōrua mātauranga, o kōrua whakaro mo tēnei kaupapa, te COVID. I'd just like to, I'll just let our audience know how the format's going to go today. We're going to have Dr. Ganesh Nana, he's going to present first, and then we'll follow with Dara, who will do her presentation as well, giving us a very strong Indigenous lens on what economies look like. Just to introduce both our fantastic speakers today, Ganesh is, he has done a lot of work on the Māori economy. He plays a big role in all the quantifying of what Māori economy means, and he has always been insistent and pushing Māori to come up and develop our own measurements of what value and wealth means. So I'm very grateful for the challenges that Ganesh has put to us. Dara is a colleague and very good friend of mine. Her insight and depths into Indigenous economies always enlighten me. She always challenges me to think and reframe things differently. So we have got very interesting perspectives that are going to be brought to us today, whānau. So tune in. Also, if you have any questions that are prompting you while these guys are talking, please put them up in our comments, and we will try and get to them after their kōrero. So I think I've covered everything, guys? Yeah, so I think we'll hand it over to you now, Ganesh, and yeah, we wait in anticipation for your insights. All right, here we go.
Kia ora kiri, kia ora dara, and kia ora tātou. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a difficult time for many of us, and I think I'd just like to open with acknowledgement of the many of us that are making sacrifices for others at this time. Some of us, myself included, are in a relatively privileged position where the sacrifices aren't really that great. But for others, I know, doing it tough, and for them, we owe a lot. I'd just like to start, though, with myself. My name's Ganesh. I'm a first-generation New Zealander. I'd like to acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua of Aotearoa, and like to acknowledge my tupuna, your tupuna, and our tupuna who have built this nation and provided us with the many benefits and taonga that we have, and that we play with and utilise, and hopefully leave in a situation that we can pass on to our next generation. And for those who don't know me, that's my definition of economics. It is very much how we inherit treasures or resources, which is what the academic economists call it, how we inherit them, how we use them, and how we pass them on. Very little to do with dollars and cents. And I think that's my perspective, always has been, that there are many out there who confuse economics with finance. The two are extremely different, and that's part of the narrative that we've got to ensure that we encourage others to pick up, so that we come out of our most latest mess in stronger positions, not just for you and me, but for those who have, I suppose, done it a lot harder than many of us over the last 2 or 3 generations. There's my title. I think I put it out there because I want to attract an audience, I suppose. But yes, it is something that I honestly believe. Capitalism is great for its uses. I'm an economist, I've got to say. Capitalism has been a pretty good invention that we've had, but it has some significant and severe limitations, and I've read the textbook. It has strong limitations, and unfortunately those limitations, or what economists will call those imperfections, we tend to gloss over. And bluntly, when it comes to crisis, capitalism is absolutely hopeless. And that invisible hand that's supposed to rule the capitalist market is great when it works, but when it comes to a crisis, the invisible hand usually or almost certainly goes missing in action. And we can see that quite now in terms of responses out there. I don't want to take up too much of our time, because I definitely don't want to go into Dara's time as well, and I do want to leave some time for a discussion afterwards. But I'll just go through a little bit of a history and how actually we got into this mess of believing that capitalism was our saviour. About 40 odd years ago, training as an economist, as a baby economics student. 40 years ago it was exactly, I was promised this new dawn, and this new dawn was one of market-led development, market-led growth, market-led prosperity. And that's what I was promised. And it was because the market knew everything. The market had this great thing called an invisible hand that would reallocate resources, you know, that great word called resources. And I'll talk about resources a bit later, but it would magically reallocate things to provide prosperity to any and everybody who was available. And that was the promise that I was given 40 odd years ago. And I look back on those 40 years and wonder, given what I inherited 40 years ago and what I'm about to pass on to the next generation 40 years later, I really do seriously wonder and question how we got here, because this is where I feel quite uncomfortable, because this is the world that I'm leaving to my mokopuna. Haven't had any yet, but I'm like cross fingers, still waiting, still hopeful. But that to me does question or lead me to seriously question my economics training, and as I have been for quite a while now. And we do have to question that capitalist perspective or that capitalist market. One of the things that the textbook was always great in telling me about how we didn't really have to worry too much about those short-term crises, because the market would sort it out, and in the long run it would work. But one of the economists that I always were quite keen on, this person called John Maynard Keynes, who some of you may or may not have heard about, wrote in the 1920s and 1930s, and he came up with this somewhat quote that many of us have heard about the long run, we are all dead, but it's the words after that quote that are quite important. And it's not just economists, it's the capitalist market that is great in telling us that actually the crises aren't the problem, because as long as we can get through the crisis, life will be sweet. And unfortunately, doesn't help us very much, because that market or that invisible hand system and process to get through crisis is actually very cruel. Basically and bluntly, what it requires is for people and firms and businesses to lose things. They lose whether it be their resources or whether it be their savings, or they lose their jobs, they lose their livelihoods, they lose their opportunities, their futures, and indeed some lose their lives. To me, that's not a great equilibrating system that I'd like to follow. And we've got to be a little bit more clever than that. This is the track record that the capitalist market has always had, that I put in front of them for people who believe the market will deliver. The market has been great in between all of these dates, but inevitably, when it comes to crisis, it's curious that we all go running to government for a rescue package. And indeed, curiously, I won't say curiously, it's actually quite, what's the word? Without any sense of irony, the people at the front of the queue waiting for government to rescue them are all inevitably those who have been the market proponents in the first place. And that's the problem. If the market was so great, we wouldn't need government to literally bail us out all the time. And actually turn it around the other way in terms of the positive perspective, in terms of contributions to wealth and prosperity, or well-being, if you like. Look at the list of the great inventions of humankind, and actually most of it requires some form of government intervention, whether it be informal or formal, whether it be broader community interventions. They've always been driven by a significantly strong element of government support or intervention. So I think we've got to be just a little bit cynical about those who claim that the market will deliver. Where's it got us 40 years later? Well, we've got a whole lot of what I call burning platforms that not just the world, but I think this little part of paradise here in Aotearoa, we face, whether it be climate change, whether it be racism and colonialism, whether it be social structures and the lack of cohesion, whether it be these robots that are galloping across the horizon to take our jobs, demographic upheaval, all of those sorts of things that we need to confront, and I don't have any faith in the market mechanism confronting any of those, given the track record. The one that that is, I suppose, closest to my heart at the moment, and I know some will argue that climate change is the biggest thing, and this is 2 months ago or 3 months ago, and I haven't even mentioned pandemics in terms of burning platforms, but this just adds to our challenges, no doubt. The biggest challenge that is closest to my heart is the inequality challenge, and it goes to the heart of the lack of social cohesion, I suppose the election of people like Donald Trump, the Brexit arguments. It is, in my opinion, driven by this, the capitalist system driving us into bunkers and excluding a fair proportion of our population. And once we exclude them, they don't want to play by the rules of the game. Why should they? They're not getting anything out of the system. That inequality graph that I've got in front of you, that's the picture for New Zealand, not for the world. 2 lines, maybe a little bit complicated to go through in detail, but the horizontal axis measures all of the households in New Zealand in terms of proportions, up to 100%. The vertical axis is the measure of the distribution of financial wealth across financial income and wealth across those households. And if we had a reasonable sense of equality in terms of the distribution of income and wealth and financial income, financial wealth, those lines would be pretty close to that straight diagonal line from the bottom left corner to the top right corner. The closer we are to that line, the closer we are to a sense of equality. The dashed blue line is the distribution of income across New Zealand's households in the latest figure we've got is 2017. And if you follow that dashed blue line across to about halfway across the horizontal axis, you get to basically half of New Zealand's households have 20% of the income. Turn that round the other way, half of New Zealand's households have 80% of our income. I'm not sure about you, but I feel reasonably uncomfortable with that. I'm not suggesting we should be all totally equal, because there are some pretty clever people out there, people way cleverer than me, that probably should get a little bit more income than I do. I accept that, but I just think that distribution of income is just looking a little bit uncomfortable for me. But then I go to that brown line, which is the distribution of financial wealth. And that's what scares the living daylights out of me, to be honest. We've got to a situation where if you go across that horizontal axis, you've got the lowest 20%, or the first 20% of households don't even get above the axis. They are literally underwater. They have no financial wealth whatsoever. That means they haven't got a house, they're renting. KiwiSaver or any sense of savings is a dream. They will be probably borrowing not from banks, but from those loan sharks that have the privilege of charging them 0.8% per day interest. That's quite scary, because it's not just financial wealth that is the problem. But without that financial wealth, they have no opportunities, not just for themselves, but for their mokopuna, for the next generation. What is this inequality that we are embedding into the future, given that picture? Turn it around the other way. If you go all the way across on that brown line, up towards the other end and head towards about 90% of households, and you go up and you see 90% of households have about 50% of the wealth. Turn it around the other way, 10% of New Zealand's households have half of the nation's wealth. And to me, that gives me serious worries about the inequities that are now embedded in the system for the next generation and beyond. That those opportunities that are closing off for those whānau and families and households, the opportunity to own a house, the opportunity to use a house to go into business. Most New Zealand businesses are based on mortgaging the family home. The opportunity to engage in broader education, the opportunities to develop skills, the opportunities to engage in communities and to contribute to those communities are being fast closed off. And that's, in my mind, that's New Zealand for those people who think that the inequality argument is far away and we only have to worry about the US and UK where there's inequality. How did we get here? This is the economic model that we've been following for the last 40 odd years. It starts at productivity. If you haven't heard that word, well, that's my world. It's all about productivity. It's all about producing more and more stuff, more and more things, using those resources that we inherited. Don't worry about how we use them because they're ours. We own them, don't forget. I'm being cynical here, but I'll go into that in a second. We own them so we can use them however we like, extract as much as we can from it. That's been productive. That will, with a bit of luck, make myself profitable. And if I'm profitable, I can pay the workers a little bit more. That's the model we have. The pay to the workers has always been at the end of the queue. Our story and our argument about why we can't pay people a decent wage, even the minimum wage, is difficult for most businesses because we are not productive and we're not profitable, so the workers just have to work a lot harder. To me, that model is just way too simple. You'll see it's very linear. It all starts with productive, and the only way we are able to pay people more is if they're more productive. They just got to work harder and smarter and all of that story. And then eventually we'll figure out a way to pay you more. After 40 odd years in that previous graph, I think we've had that model for way too long. It's had enough time to prove itself and it's failed miserably. The picture next to it, for those who don't like words, basically if you have the money, you can enjoy prosperity. If you haven't got the money, you don't enjoy prosperity. And by the way, it's probably your fault because you're not productive. As I say, I think that model is way too simple. I think it's a way more complicated model. Here's my simple, complicated model of the world in terms of the way the economy functions anyway. Yes, productivity is important. Yes, profitability is important. And yes, pay is important. All of those things are not measured in terms of dollars. They're should be measured in terms of well-being. I'll talk about that in a second. The other thing that, as you will see, it's not a very simple diagram. It doesn't start at one place and goes in and ends in another. It's a circle. Circles are very difficult as models because you have no idea where to start, and I don't claim where to start. I don't claim to know where we should start. And to make it even more complicated, the circle goes in both directions. It's a complicated model, so let's stop pretending it's simple. We could start at productivity. I would suggest we could start at pay. Wouldn't it be a good idea to pay people a little bit more? That might actually make them more incentivized and encouraged to be part of the game and play by the rules of the game. And who knows, they might actually turn out to be productive in the end if we pay people slightly more than the minimum wage. I've never got this idea that you pay people a minimum wage and work them for 60 hours a week and then expect them to be productive on Monday morning when they turn back up at work or not. Given, especially after those 60 hours a week in a job on the minimum wage, they still have difficulty putting food on their table for their moko. It just doesn't make sense. Here's a different world. Here's some, again, sort of that same story, but using some different words, going to those resources that economists love to talk about. The diagram on the left-hand side, that's the world that I think some of us are still in. The resources are there to be used because we own them. and we have a right to extract them, and we can exploit them for as much as we like. We consume them. The more we consume, the better, because our GDP goes up, so that must be good. By consuming them, we have a habit of depleting those resources, and then if we're lucky, we might set aside a little bit of effort to replenish those resources and throw some dollars at making the waters a little bit more healthier, and replenish the land with a few more chemicals into them, and then we can consume them again. That, to me, it's another version of that linear type model, that the arrows work just in one direction, and it's all focused on the ability to own resources and then use and extract them. I have a different model that I'd like to just throw in front of you, whether you call it a business model or an economic model. Rather than looking at resources from a use perspective, I really like to term resources as treasures, something that we actually want to look after. And I actually see economics as not as a way of use or as a model for using resources. It's actually a model for looking after resources. Kaitiaki, guardianship. We are guardians of the resources. We actually don't own the resources. We don't own this land. We don't own the waterways. I know there's a big argument in New Zealand about who owns the water. I don't want to go there, because actually owning the water is not the issue. It's how we use them and how we look after the resources, the taonga that have been given to us by previous generations, and how we ensure that they are in a state to be passed on. So yes, we can use them. We can reap the bounty out of the taonga that we have. We can enrich them. We can protect them. That's how we build well-being. So it is a model around kaitiakitanga. Then we can actually start talking about what are the treasures that we have to look after. And so it's not, in my mind, just land, labour and capital, which is the capitalist model. Land, labour, we don't call them people, we call it labour. And capital, which is dollars. Taonga are, yes, it's land. Yes, it's waterways. Yes, it's the minerals in the land and in the air. It's also the whakapapa that we inherited. It's also te treaty that sets up the structures that are supposed to, the rules and the laws that we're supposed to abide by in engaging in community. All of those are taonga that we need to look after. And if we leave significant sections of the community behind us or to one side, then why would they abide by those rules and regulations? Why would they look after those sorts of structures if they're not, if they have no skin in the game, if they get no sense of being part of the game? So my kaupapa as economics it's not about the allocation of scarce resources. It's how do we guard those resources? How do we perform our role and function and duty of being guardians? It's not being owners, it is being guardians. And that's where, hang on, I'll go to this picture in a second. I'll just go back to that. This is where I don't want to put a huge amount of onus or responsibility on Māori in terms of their models, but I think this is where, for want of a better word, the mainstream New Zealand economy, New Zealand businesses and the way we run our place need to be a little bit more humble and actually look towards some Māori organisations and the business models that they have. I don't want to look through rose-tinted glasses. I do have questions about some of the business models that some Māori organisations have adopted, but I do think that some Māori organisations need to stop looking at Western business models and figure out how they can adopt them, and I actually think it needs to be the other way. I think Māori need to be a lot more courageous in retaining their own business models. I know many have kaupapa and many talk the words about 500-year long-term plans and business plans. I think it's a struggle, and yes, it's a struggle, but you, us, need to be stronger about the business models that we know about, that have been built through the values that we inherited. Those business models, Māori have, and I don't want to tell you your own history, but Māori have had business models for many centuries. Now is not the time to ditch them. And yes, okay, Māori have lost some of those business models, lost some of that capability over the last, 4 or 5 generations for reasons that you know full well about. But now's the time to not only bring those models back, but to remember those models and entrench them, rather than, dare I say, take the MBA processes, the learnings or the studies from other models that, dare I say, have actually failed. Let's start using the models that we know, and let's be courageous about our own teachings. Just to put in front of you the question, one of those challenges around the demographic Armageddon that everybody talks about, and actually let's put Māori front and centre. There's the Armageddon scenario that New Zealand keeps talking about in terms of lots of older people like me, and I'm quite looking forward to being a burden on everybody, which is fine because I'm reasonably comfortable. But how are we going to face this burden? The story that I'm sure many of you know, but I suppose I quite like putting in front of the policy players in Wellington anyway, is they should, if not know already, the pyramid for Māori. And in terms of for want of a better, the economy and the business going forward over the next however many decades, it is Māori that are going to be front and centre. And now is the time for Māori to be leaders, not just in terms of the workforce, because the policy people, the business people in the mainstream will just see this as a workforce for the future. Let's have Māori as leaders of the business models and framers of the next business models that we're going to adopt post the rather horrendous period that we've got going ahead of us. And I suppose, yes, let's go to COVID-19 and pandemics. It's a scary world. We've got a whole lot of the market players and the business players out there lining up for government intervention and being at the front of the queue for those bailouts. Now is the time, though, not to ditch the kaupapa that we've had for a long time. For those organisations that have had a long-term kaupapa, don't ditch them now for the short-term knee-jerk response about the last thing we need is lots of people running around saying the sky is falling. Leave that to the others, the people who do run around saying the sky is falling. They're the ones who are going to go by the by. Those ones with strong values, strong kaupapa around looking after the people, looking after whānau, looking after the resources. The taonga are going to be here for a lot longer than pandemics, and I don't say that flippantly, and that's not understating the impact that the pandemic is going to have. But we've got to focus on delivering well-being to our people, not just now, but into the future. It is all about access, ability, and capacity. It's not about dollars. All of those things is a lot easier if you have dollars. I will say that openly, yes. But there's a reason why we spend a day on our board retreats or whatever they are, our governorship, or you send the board on a retreat to discuss for the day what is the values and the mission and the vision and all of those sorts of things, and you spend whatever it is, half a day on figuring out where the commas go in your mission statements. Now's not the time to ditch those, and actually you shouldn't be rejigging those. The values that underpin them remain the same. As long as they are at the forefront of your business decisions, then you're fine. the most important thing as business people, and I use business with a small b, whether it depends on, and I'm not saying you're a profit-oriented organisation. If you're a well-being-oriented organisation, you're still in business with a small b. You're still an organisation looking after our taonga, looking after those resources and figuring out a way to deliver well-being. The decisions that you make, the most important thing you must have front of mind is who is not in the room when you're making those decisions, who are not being represented. And I think that's the biggest thing that we've always forgotten. And that's not just Māori, well, it's not particularly Māori, I'd say that's everybody. The most important, I suppose, and perhaps Māori know that the moko aren't in the room, but it's what we've forgotten in the mainstream. The next generation, the mainstream economic businesses have always forgotten about the next generation. They always talk about stakeholders, but they forget that the next generation should be in the room when we make those decisions, if we're serious about passing on those resources. And that's not just climate change. Climate change brings that front and centre, but it's more than climate change. It's about those opportunities. It's that inequality argument. If we're serious about making sure that the next generation are in the room, we've got to make sure that the current generation are at the table, those who literally are never at the table. And that's the challenge that I put in front of everybody. It's not an easy challenge, and it's made a lot difficult because of the last 4 weeks. But then I don't want to put this easy, but Māori, it's never been easy for Māori. It's never been easy for any group in the population that have been colonised, that have had 4 or 5 generations of learning and whakapapa taken away from them. But now is the time to not just restore them, but to use them, and to use them for, dare I say, the benefit of all New Zealand rather than just Māori, because I think, honestly, given the mess that my generation have made of the last 40 years, we've got a lot to learn from Māori and indeed other indigenous groups in the world around how we look after the place and how we make sure that the benefits and the well-being that accrues is distributed a lot more, dare I say, fairly. I'll leave that with you. Look forward to the discussion afterwards. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Oh, kia ora, Ganesh. Thanks for that. I'll bring Dara up and then we'll go into our next presentation. Take it away, Dara. Oh.
Kia ora to all of our audience all over the world. It's fantastic to see everybody online, and we can see all of your comments, so keep those going for questions at the end. So I will start. I'm not sure, for anybody who was not tuned in yesterday, my name is Dara Kelly. I come from the Lakamel First Nation, and I also have heritage from the Tsai'alis First Nation. I am an assistant professor of Indigenous business at the Beatty School of Business that is here at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. So we are in Canada right now, and I wanted to present some insights from the research that I conducted from my doctoral work. And I wanted to also make a connection to some of the things that Linda Smith was talking about with us on Monday. So Linda was connecting some of the challenges, the economic challenges that we are all experiencing right now. There's unmistakable changes taking place, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of negative impact happening with regards to labor and the people losing jobs and the very real challenges that we face of having to put food on our tables and look after our family and look after our communities. So that's very real, and we want to make sure that that is not forgotten amidst the conversations that we're having. But at the same time, I also am seeing this incredible opportunity that arises from a moment when we are all being forced to conduct our work differently, to participate in our families differently, participate in our societies differently. And so I think what I'm seeing is an opportunity that says that the systems we have in place are not necessarily fixed. Although that we have lots of institutional structures and mechanisms around the economics, the way that we conduct ourselves within the economy today is not necessarily fixed, and that we actually have a huge opportunity and a window to make change as well. And so I want to pick up on that because so what Linda was commenting on was about the fact that capitalism is a very resilient system. And it's also a system that is supported with a whole range of institutions around it. And those can be very challenging to change. So Linda was also talking about alternative models of economy and the resources that we have in the form of leadership. What are the responsibilities that we want our leaders to make sure to hold up? How do we encourage indigenous control over the modes of production? And that's really important because the modes of production are also connected to the ways that we distribute our resources and our wealth. And so for particularly vulnerable communities, and so many of our family and communities who are elderly or young children, we always need to be able to take care of them. And so this is where we, by and large, economic systems are not meeting those needs very well. And so this is connected to the system that is failing, that Ganesh has actually pointed to and been able to show us through his work. So with that in mind, I would like to move on to my slides and talk about the work within my doctoral research. I conducted interviews with elders within my community, and one of the things that I think comes forward is this thinking about that increasing. So this quote highlights raising incomes and the challenge of raising incomes as not being a meaningful goal, because what is at the heart of that is pointing to a sort of a fixed set of wealth that not everybody has access to. And so if you increase that, then you're putting a greater demand on the same amount of, or the same pie. And you're just asking more people to dip into the same pie. And so many social scientists are thinking that economic growth, the idea of growing wealth in this way, should no longer be the main goal for our societies. Okay, so this raises a really interesting question with regards to indigenous knowledge and the economic knowledge that comes from our ancient philosophies and our ancient practices. So this question of what do indigenous philosophies have to contribute to the global conversation around economic growth, wealth, and development. So this brought me to questions where I wanted to know more, looking back to our traditions of feasting. our traditions of feasting here along the north, the sort of broader region is the northwest coast of Canada. And thinking about our feasts used to be enormous institutions where we would bring together anywhere from 200 to 1,000 people to come and bear witness to transactions that we set out to take place. And so in order to record your transactions in an oral historical culture, so we did not have any writing, we didn't have a written lexicon, in order to, in essence, activate your legal structures for business transactions, you have to bring people together in order to witness what we call work. We refer to this as work in ceremony. And so this is what this fundamental question is pointing to, is that beyond those transactions, so beyond the work that needs to take place, what is it that a feast enables people to do? And this is what starts to come to light through the interviews that I conducted. So this notion of an economy of affection comes forward. The word affection has limitations. It's not obviously an indigenous word. I would like to replace this word in my work with an indigenous word from the Halkomelem language. But it is a reflection of an ethic of care that our feasting practices enable in order to conduct our transactions. So what it is a system of relational affective exchange. It's a mechanism for communities to come together to conduct the business that they need to conduct, but in the process, they're also bringing communities together in order to connect, in order to ensure that everybody's well, and in essence, embedded within the economy is a system of relational care. So the name, the quote that is at the beginning of my presentation comes from one of our elders, Chief Richard Malloway. He's passed on a number of years ago, and he is quoted as saying, "Always feed your guests, and when you do that, you'll never go hungry." So in this quote, what is embedded within the ethic of feasting is this idea that through the wealth distribution, through the physical and metaphorical feasting, you are able to ensure that everybody is fed and the future generations are going to be fed, so that when you do the feeding, there's an embedded relationship of reciprocity that says that when you demonstrate that generosity, the future generations will also demonstrate that in exchange, and other families and other communities will also have this obligation to show generosity as well. So when I was asking the elders what is our definition of wealth, the response that I got back was this word, siam. Now, what's interesting about the word siam is it is also the same word for a leader. So so a siam and a leader are connected because a siam is somebody who understands their lineage. They know who they are. And so this notion of being wealthy is connected to being able to understand your lineage. And I know that for Maori, this is whakapapa. And the opposite is true. So to not have any understanding of your knowledge is to be poor. And so this is really interesting because from this perspective, we have dual definitions of wealth and poverty emerging, where I'm sure it's the same the world over. There's a sense of relative poverty that comes up, where our communities were experiencing poverty in terms of overcrowding within houses, in terms of being able to necessarily, the conditions for living would not be the same as non-Indigenous households. But at the same time, there was also a structure of seasonal wealth, which says that in the summertime, families would go spend their time at the river, and there was always these stories that would come forward that said, if we were able to feed ourselves from the river every day, have fresh food, we were able to support ourselves, then we knew that we were wealthy every day. But at the same time, we would go into the main town centers and we would be told in schools or in the urban centers that we are poor. And so there was this dual understanding of being both poor and wealthy at the same time. Now, the second piece of this notion of wealth is the concept of knowledge, that knowledge represents a form of wealth in and of itself. But at the same time, knowledge doesn't mean anything if you are not able to share it, or if you choose not to share your knowledge, then the elders said to me, if you don't share your knowledge, then you're not wealthy. And so there was this dual understanding that to be wealthy was to be a leader. It also means that you understand your lineage, you know who you are, you have access to knowledge, and often those two things are inseparable, because what you, in many cases, you cannot have the knowledge without the genealogy, and likewise, the knowledge without the genealogy without the knowledge is also something different. So there was this understanding that the both of them work together. And so this quote just came up. There was a lot of wealth in who you were, but there was also wealth in knowledge. So this was one of the excerpts from the interviews. This notion of banking came up with regards to the feasting practices. So the gathering is another word for the feast, and the elders were explaining that the gathering is a form of banking. So by bringing people together, by feeding everybody, by conducting work, and by allocating resources that go to families and communities, there's this sense of putting away for the future. And so although they were talking about ceremony, this word banking actually comes up all the time. The idea that your resources are there, and banking is something that is a way of putting your resources for future generations. And you do that by giving your resources to other families and other communities who may need it in the present day, but that transaction will eventually come back to you. And that comes forward in another concept, another framing of debt. So I wanted to share this quote from one of the interviews. So it looks long, but I'll read it out loud. The elder said, "We had visitors from Vancouver Island, from Cowichan tribe. This lady was giving away money to the people that were going to do a memorial. They were calling witnesses to do the work. And my dad told my brother and young people, and he said, you pay attention to what this woman's doing. She's putting money in the bank. She's putting money in the bank. She's going to call a witness and tell you what she's doing. She's giving so much money to this family that are having a potlatch or a memorial service, and she wants you to remember. So whenever she has work to do, these people that she's giving money to, they have to give it back, and they may give interest. on what she gave you. So they were required to give the same amount or more than they received. It's like having interest in the bank, you know, you put a lot of money in the bank like that. So this is a demonstration, an example of how banking operates within a ceremony. So this is kind of my final slide. It's a fairly simple diagram, but it is representative of one aspect. What I wanted to really show within this slide is that why would we conduct our transactions within ceremony? This outside circle on the slide shows that within our sense of worldview and within our sense of who we are, so our worldview was oriented around the river, the Fraser River here in Vancouver. And so if your entire sense of being is oriented with the river and your transactions and your economy is founded in the very essence of incorporating a higher, the cosmos, what we call creator or house, and we have many different layers to our spirituality. But the river itself is sacred, people are sacred, and this higher energy source is sacred. So the reason for conducting all of your transactions within ceremony is to make sure that the work that you're doing and your economic behavior is entirely grounded within the sacred obligations that we have as human beings to one another. It's grounded in an ethic that says the environment is sacred, and we honor that within our economic transactions. And we know that as humble human beings, our transactions are never superior to this greater sense of cosmology and the universe and the greater world that we live in. And so I wanted to be able to show that spirituality is very central to the feasting practices of the Coast Salish people. And I do pose this question with regards to businesses and economics today. Particularly, it's a challenge for us as Indigenous peoples to really think, what is the economy that we would like to create for our future generations? And I wonder if our economy is absent of our spirituality and absent of our spiritual sense of being as people, then perhaps we are not necessarily operating within the values of our ancestors. So it's something that I think we really need to think about. But I also wonder if this is the time when this question is very pertinent, because of this opening or this chance where we've had to shift fundamentally how we are within our economic transactions. So that is the end of my presentation. I think that we are going to move into a little bit of a dialogue with Katie and Ganesh and myself. And we also have a question from the audience, and we can bring that in a little bit later.
All right. Thanks, you for the very stimulating kōrero. You can see from the Facebook reaction that there's a lot of excitement out there with regards to trying to access Indigenous tools and using them to rebuild our economies. So I thought I might go to, I've got heaps of questions and notes. I thought I might ask you both, what is the opportunity out of COVID for Indigenous communities? Because I just, you know, at the moment we've seen capitalism being shaken right down, and I use the analogy of an earthquake. Our systems have been shaken to rubble. So we're going to have to rebuild. And most of us don't want to rebuild back to what we already have. So what is that opportunity in this rebuild?
It's a tough one. I think the opportunities are around the structures and the networks and the institutions, for want of a better word, that are already present within Māoridom, within the indigenous communities, and to take comfort, feel strong, feel courageous in those structures, and actually take those out as models for behaviour and for others to adopt, rather than turning inwards and questioning ourselves about what do we have to change? Well, I think the change that has to be made within Māori and Indigenous communities is that, I suppose, that sense of strength and what's the word? A sense that they are actually on the right track, that actually values do matter, and you can actually engage in, whether it be business or transactions, from a values perspective. This is what you want out of the transaction. If you've got a partner, well, okay, but I'm only going to partner up with you if you share my set of values. I'm not interested in you imposing values on me. So rewriting the rules of the game, so to speak, rather than always accepting someone else's rules of the game.
Yeah,
I
I would agree with that. I think a lot of the shifting that represents the opportunity is a reframing. So I really like in Ganesh's work the reframing towards taonga and the idea of guardianship, as opposed to an allocation of resources. Very, very different if you look at the principles that underpin that form of economy. There's also, I think, rather than an emphasis, of course, on wealth accumulation, the question that always comes to my mind is, well, but the wealth distribution component of our economies has really fallen off, where that's where we rely on the government and we rely on these sort of external systems, but actually we really had quite sophisticated systems to ensure that wealth distribution was taking place. And so there's that shift. And then, of course, the other shift that I'm thinking about is a shift from scarcity and the idea that everything is centered around scarce resources, when in fact we have different forms of abundance. And what would that look like? Because I think if we're going to measure scarcity versus we measure abundance, that changes. And of course, measurement is another piece that would require a significant shift. But I think that a lot of that is about, how do we structure this economy? What is it we really want out of it?
Exactly, and that's the last point, is the critical thing. It's what is the objective? And I think we've got an economy that is structured around the objective is always more. We want more, so we have to produce more of whatever it is. And more stuff is obviously better stuff. So if we can produce more stuff, we're somehow better off. Reframe that, or actually start thinking, what is our objective? What's our reason for being? And so that's what can reframe the whole argument. Whether you use the well-being perspective and the objective is to improve well-being, or whether you use my objective, which is the ability to pass on taonga to the next generation, and then that drives into, what do you measure? If you've got a different objective, you're going to measure things differently as well.
So, I'm a bit of an opportunist, and the reason why I really wanted to hold this discussion is because the world is very vulnerable at the moment. And I'm thinking, look, we can really get in there. We can really intercept these vulnerable minds with our wonderful Indigenous frames and lenses of economies. So I thought I might pose quite a difficult question, and I'm pretty sure you'll get a Nobel Peace Prize if you can answer it. But how do we shift a paradigm?
It's not easy. I mean, as you know, the capitalist market mechanism system is all powerful. It's all got to do with power. The way, or a way of pushing back, is to form alliances. We've actually got to figure out who are our friends, who are our alliances, who have got the most to gain from, or who is been left out of the current system, who doesn't have power, and is there a way of bringing them into the alliances to, for want of a better, balance up that power somehow. And I think from that perspective, we've got to look at the people who have been disenfranchised for so long, been left off the table, and bring them to the table. And that's incumbent on all of us as leaders to actually look beyond our own, dare I say, our own comfort zones, and actually bring in the alliances with those who are, for want of a better, at the coalface, who are doing it hard and doing it tough, and use their expertise, capabilities, and experiences to shift the dial.
Mm-hmm. I would agree that a lot of it has to do with power, but I think that power can be shifted in really significant ways. So challenging this assumption that economics is a science for the elite, that number one is our fundamental shift that we can make, because I truly believe that, what I just spoke about our feasting and our ceremony, there's nobody in the community who wouldn't know what a feast is and how it works, and when we do our gifting, and why do you feed your guests, why do you take care of them. All of that is about practicing those fundamental universal values, aroha, manakitanga, bringing all of that forward and insisting that those are economic values.
Oh, exactly. Yes, yeah. And extracting or getting away from this myth that economics is all about finance. And that's the biggest, economics itself has been hijacked by the financiers. And so economics and the economics discipline has got a lot of work to do to, as you say, get back to its roots about what is the objective, why are we here? And even the economics textbooks that I grew up with, the objective was never actually accumulating dollars. The objective, they said in chapter 1, first page, was about, in the jargon, was maximizing utility. I interpret utility as well-being. It was a bit of jargon, but then in the other 37 chapters of the textbook, we never got to talk about utility, because we always just assumed that it was dollars.
It's a good point, Dara. I mean, I even spoke to you earlier today, and I said a lot of people, as soon as they see that word economy or economics, they just instantly shut off from it, because they think it's a thing over there. But we need to become more engaged in our economic systems, because a lot of us are unconsciously influenced by the behaviors of those structures and systems.
Undoubtedly.
What about, I've just got a couple more things I really want to get out of you. What about this statement that indigenous economic systems can't handle modern day demands? Or this idea that traditional economies, indigenous economies, are backward. You've got anything more?
I can't see the evidence of that. And again, it's that understanding of what economics and economies are. We all operate in economies, right down to the very basics. Our household, our individual households, our whānau, those are economic systems where we make decisions about whether it be transactions or who has what and how much. So it's that, I think that sort of comment to me is a fundamental misunderstanding of what economics and economies is about. And it's, we need to push back with that and say, well, we're all in economies. It's actually up to us to start understanding them so that we do make, or so that the decisions aren't left to those who have the power.
I'm glad you said that, because Dara and I are part of a group, and we do a lot of work into North America, presenting our economic philosophies, and they often get poo-pooed for being dated, I guess, and able to.
Sorry, I suppose it's that's sort of that pushback I get from the mainstream here in New Zealand when we introduced, or when the mainstream introduced this well-being perspective a couple of years ago, and everybody in the economy said, yeah, okay, we'll do well-being, but we'll put it to one side because it's not really important. And I think it's, again, trying to shift that argument about what is the objective of an economy, what is the objective of our economic system. And the financiers have told us that it's the objective is to increase GDP or income or profits, whereas I'd actually go back and say, actually, no, that wasn't the objective. Even my objective from the white Western textbook that I got given, it was maximising utility. And then they say, oh, I remember that. So, and then start talking about utility and well-being, and then maybe bring in things like values. Because again, that question about value is interesting, because economists are supposed to know about value, and you actually push them a lot harder and actually say, well, they'll say the market economy, well, value is the price in the market, but actually it's not. Value is something significantly different. And we start opening up that conversation, and you get some economists getting very outside their comfort zone and very uncomfortable. And I think that's what we've got to do.
I think it also assumes that the current system is actually satisfying everybody, yes, but it's not. No, it's not. So it's kind of it's an argument that assumes that it's right.
It does.
Yeah.
Well, it believes it's right because it has the power to say it's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got one more question, but I just wondered if there was any kind of comments before I ask, or anything that you guys wanted to speak to.
Probably not. I've talked too much already.
Oh, we love listening to you, Ganesh. You got a bit of a fan club there on Facebook. I think Daniel Hikuro's got a question here. How reliant, no, it's not, it's a statement. Look how reliant we are on money, and how stuffed we are when its flow almost stopped. Yeah. Tika, okay.
And I think that thing about money is, again, that understanding of what money actually is. Money is only a vehicle. It's the means to the end, not the end in itself. So accumulation of money is not the end in itself. It's why are we here? You know, what is the end? And I think that's where indigenous economies, I believe, do have a contribution to make, is actually to build that narrative about what is the objective, whether it's a values-based system, whether it's well-being, or whatever other words you want to use. But build that, because if we can solidly, you know, what is our kaupapa? We solidly ingrain that into the mechanism, then we can start talking about money as the vehicle rather than the objective.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. This is just my own curiosity why I'm asking this. Post-COVID predictions. What's going to happen to travel? What's going to happen to New Zealand imports, exports? And what's going to be the major global pain points? So what's the future predictions, guys?
I think the imports, exports of goods, in my mind, isn't or won't be a big problem. I can see goods trade, and even now, the flow of goods across borders is reasonably okay. The biggest change is going to be the movement of people, and that's something that we're going to have to get used to. But even I'm thinking, even in an optimistic scenario for New Zealand, okay, the lockdown, however many, optimistic scenario lifted in 2 or 3 weeks or something like that. a little bit patchy over the next few months thereafter, with maybe some regions more affected than others. But that's the optimistic scenario for New Zealand. But the international borders, in terms of people, I believe are going to be locked down for quite a lot longer. And that's even under a good scenario, because the rest of the world really hasn't got its handle on this thing. And why would we open up our borders when at the risk of bringing the pandemic back into New Zealand? So that's a different world. Obviously, international tourism is something that's just not going to happen for quite a while. And I think we're going to have to, well, hopefully we use that as a breather to actually reorient the New Zealand international tourism sector, economy, again, around what is the objective, why are we doing that, in terms of I don't, and I'm not understating just how big that change is going to be. The other way is how New Zealand is going to feel about not being able to travel abroad, because that's sort of in our DNA and has been for quite a while. International pain points, you can go to some quite scary scenarios about US and UK, which I probably don't want to go because I don't want to go too gloomy. But again, I don't see a good scenario in terms of the rest of the world getting back on its feet. Definitely not within 12 months in terms of it. Those sorts of, just in terms of their own communities, their own societies, let alone their own economies. So that's a world that New Zealand's going to have to operate in. So yes, we can get goods and services, and we can probably sell our food and our stuff overseas, but it's just going to make life just a whole lot different. And we're going to start thinking, and this is the opportunity to start thinking about maybe we might want to do things just a little bit differently.
Dara?
Yeah.
Prediction?
I don't know about predictions, but I am keeping a really close watch on what's happening with the environment. Because, I mean, it's fascinating. We've had orcas, killer whales coming into our bay in Vancouver that have not been there for 59 years. Obviously, all over the news there was about the dolphins in Italy. You've got air pollution clearing up in LA. I think that all of that is like connecting with your poem at the beginning, Katie. That idea of that Papatuanuku, Mother Earth, is we're giving her this great break, and she really, really needs it. And I think that it's something where there's actually a lot of good in that. I do wonder, though, about this huge drop in population. I think there's going to be economic implications for that, but I don't know what that's going to look like, because population is something that is so central to global measures around economies and economic development. And I do wonder then, with the population drops, how that also is going to affect inequality and measures around inequality, because I also am sort of getting the sense that it's had this huge leveling effect as well, where it is by and large the sort of more precarious work that people in sort of, what's the word, non-necessary non-essential jobs are losing their jobs, right? And so but at the same time, there's people who are losing their jobs all over the place, with the huge, especially airlines. Everybody's out of work with regards to that travel environment. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to be like in a year's time. What will our world look like in terms of, I don't know.
Yeah. And the other thing that, and I think a year is probably quite a short time horizon in this context, but I think what you will see now is the appetite for for government, for want of a better word, for government intervention is a lot more open now than it ever was before, because they're the only ones left standing. And so the I suppose opportunity to shape that government intervention and actually let's do something about that inclusive, sustainable economy that we were promised a long time, that transformation that we were promised here in New Zealand. The opportunity is probably there given the acceptance that government is going to have to be a big driver of the economy, at least over the next, probably more than a year, if not longer. So you are talking about opportunities to invest in infrastructure that is a lot more, shall I say, nice to the earth rather than it has been in the past. The other flip side is this future of work stuff. Everybody's getting ideas of actually working from home might be a reasonably good idea. Maybe not forever, but and then what does that do to the way we build cities and towns? Because everything's been built on roads.
Okay, so I think we can probably end on that note, unless you've got anything last minute comments you want to get in there. I think just bringing us back to the beginning of our session with that poem and that, this is hurting. This is hurting for a lot of people, but it is giving Papa Tuanuku the rest and the break that this earth needs. And I look forward to a more flourishing and thriving environment because of it.
Do you want to mention tomorrow's session?
Tomorrow we have Bonnie Duran. She's going to be doing Indigenous presence. She's going to have a mindfulness session with us, and we have the wonderful Maria Elena who's going to be hosting her. So tune in tomorrow, guys. We're not only academics, but we are TV producers and everything else you can think of. So on that note, ka kite.
Ka kite.